sold to a trail boss as cook and beaten each night. A cowboy left with her at dawn and gave her rest. The coffee pot was cold when I lifted it off the dead fire that morning. That's what I remember first. Not her face, not the sound she made, not even the dark bruise along her jaw that I could see clear from 15 feet. The cold pot. Because a woman who had been up since before light every day for 6 weeks didn't let that fire die unless something had gone bad wrong the night before. I set it back down on the stone ring and didn't say a word. Just walked to where she was standing at the tailgate of the chuck wagon, her back to me, both hands flat on the wood like she needed the wagon to hold herself upright. The drive was out of the Cimarron country, headed north to the railroad. 60-some head, 17 men, and one woman Dillard Rice had acquired in Tucumcari the way some men acquire a good mule, a transaction he was proud of and liked to mention. He'd paid a debt with her. That was how he told it. Her husband owed and couldn't pay, and so Dillard took what he could get, which was the man's wife, who could cook. I'd hired on as a day hand 2 weeks into the drive. I wasn't part of that original arrangement. I didn't know the whole of it right away. I pieced it together from what I saw and from what the other men didn't bother to hide. Her name was Ada Folk, 30-something, maybe, hard to say. Hard circumstances add years to a face in ways that are difficult to read back off. She had light brown hair she kept pinned under a cloth wrap and hands that were red and cracked from the water and the work. And she didn't speak unless spoken to, and didn't look at a man directly unless she had something to hand him. I'd been on the trail long enough to know that kind of quietness. It isn't natural, it's learned. I got my coffee that first morning from the pot before the others stirred, just me and her in the gray light, and I said thank you when she handed me the cup and she looked at me, fast like she was checking something, and then looked back at the fire. That was it. That was the whole conversation. I noticed things over the first few days, the way she moved around Rice, the small flinch when he came up behind her. The care she took not to be near him when any of the men were watching, as if drawing attention to herself was its own kind of danger. And I noticed that the other men on that drive had made a decision about what they were and were not going to see. Men do that. It's a kind of cowardice that wears the face of minding your own business. I minded mine for 4 days. 4 days is about as long as a man can do that when what he's minding away from is the sound of a woman being hurt in the dark. On the 5th night I was on last watch, 2 hours before dawn, when I heard it. The low, flat sound of a hand against skin and a woman's breath going out of her sharp, like something that couldn't be helped, coming from the direction of Rice's bedroll. I stood there in the dark for a moment that felt long. Then I walked to where my horse was picketed, and I stood with my hand on her neck in the cold, and I worked out what I was willing to do. What I was willing to do was not small. I went back to the fire and put wood on it and waited. After a while the camp was still again, and I sat there until the sky started going gray in the east. Then I walked to the chuck wagon, and I began, quietly, to do what needed doing. I took her flour sacks, what dry goods were hers, her good cast iron pan she'd told me once had come from her mother. I wrapped them in a piece of oilcloth and tied the bundle with a length of rope from the back of the wagon. I saddled my horse. I went to the mule she used to drive the wagon, and I put the bridle on him and ran a lead line back to my saddle. She came out of the dark before I was finished. She'd heard me moving around the wagon. She stood at the edge of the firelight and looked at what I was doing, and her face was careful, reading it, checking it for what kind of trouble this was. I said, "Keep your voice low," and I told her what I was doing. I told her I was leaving the drive before sunup and I was taking her with me if she'd go, and that she didn't owe me a thing for it, and I wasn't asking for a thing. I told her there was a town called Morrow's crossing 2 days west that had a woman who ran a boarding house and gave work to women who needed a start. She stood there looking at me. The bruise on her jaw was dark in the firelight. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He'll come after." I said, "Let me worry about that." She said, "You don't know him." I said, "I know the type. I've known the type my whole life. He'll file a complaint with nobody who cares and drink about it for a week and then find himself another arrangement. Men like that don't chase what they can't catch easy." She looked at me a while longer. Then she went to the wagon and came back with her bedroll and a canvas bag she'd kept under the seat, and she stood there with those things in her hands and said, "All right." We left before the camp woke. I kept the pace slow for the first hour to stay quiet across the hardpan. then brought it up once we hit softer ground, and the distance was between us, and whatever Dillard Rice was going to say about it when he rolled out and found his cook gone. I had some concern about that. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. Rice wasn't a fighting man, but he had men on that drive who were. I've been watching the outfit for 2 weeks, and I had a pretty fair sense of who would come and who wouldn't, and I put the odds at better than not that nobody came, because the men who might have the nerve for it were men who had watched what Rice did to this woman for 6 weeks and hadn't lost any sleep over it. And that kind of man has a calculating soul. He figures the trouble before he rides into it. And the trouble with coming after me was that I was a stranger, and strangers are unpredictable. I'd been told I was unpredictable my whole life. It served me. We rode through the morning, and she didn't talk much, and I didn't push it. I knew enough about what she'd come out of to understand that talk costs something when you've been trained, that saying the wrong thing has consequences. So I just rode and let the miles do what miles do, which is separate a person from what was behind them. Around mid-morning she said, without looking at me, "What's your name?" I told her, "Cole Whitfield." She said, "Why did you do that? Come back and pack my things." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, because the coffee pot was cold. She looked at me then, sideways from under the brim of that cloth wrap. She said, "That's a strange reason." I said, "It's the reason I had." She was quiet after that for a mile or so. Then she said, quietly, "I never let that fire go cold. Not once in 6 weeks." "I know," I said. She nodded just once, looking straight ahead, and didn't say anything more. We made camp that night in a draw with cottonwoods along a thin creek. I got a fire going, and she cooked without being asked, which I let her do because I could see it was something she needed, to be useful on her own terms, to do the work without the fear behind it. There's a different quality to a person doing a thing they're good at when nobody's going to hurt them for doing it wrong. She moved around that fire differently than she'd moved around any fire on that drive. She made biscuits and bacon, and she poured coffee into my cup, and when she handed it to me, she looked at me straight for the first time and she said, "Thank you, Cole Whitfield." I said, "You don't need to thank me." She said, "I know I don't need to. I want to." I looked at her across the fire. The bruise was starting to go yellow at the edges, which meant it was a few days old, which meant it wasn't from the night I'd heard. I filed that away and didn't say anything about it. We ate, and I took the first watch, and she slept, and in the morning there was no sign of anyone behind us, and we rode on. The second day she talked more. Not about Rice, not yet. About where she'd come from, which was a place in Missouri, a farm, a father who'd worked himself to nothing, and a mother who had done the same, and a husband she'd married at 18 because he'd seemed like a way out, and had turned out to be only a different kind of stuck. She told it plain, without asking for anything from me, the way a person tells a thing they've made their peace with the facts of. She wasn't sorry for herself. I respected that. I told her a little about myself. Not much. I told her I'd been moving along the cattle routes for about 15 years, picking up work, moving on, no place that had become home. She asked me why, and I said I hadn't found the right reason to stay anywhere, and she nodded at that like it was an answer she recognized. That afternoon she said, "What's Morrow's Crossing like?" I said, "Small, clean enough. The woman who runs the boarding house is named Hetty Marsh. She's all right. Fair. She'll give you work until you get your footing." Ada was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "And what will you do after you drop me there?" I said, "Pick up work somewhere. I usually do." She looked at me. She said, "You could stay a while in Morrow's Crossing." I said, "It's a small town." She said, "You said that already." We rode a while. I could feel her thinking beside me, the way a person thinks when they're working something out that matters. She said, "I'm going to be honest with you because you were honest with me." I said, "All right." She said, "I'm not looking to be somebody else's arrangement. I did that twice and I'm done with it. But I'm not," she stopped for a moment. She said, "I'm not opposed to something that's freely chosen, by both sides, if that's a thing that could be." I looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, her chin up a little, like she'd said a hard thing and wasn't going to take it back. I said, "That's an honest thing to say." She said, "I've been lied to enough times that I don't see the point of it." I said, "No. I don't either." We rode another mile or so in silence. Then I said, "I haven't stayed anywhere in 15 years, but I don't have a reason against it." She didn't say anything to that for a long time. Then she said that might be enough to start. Morrow's crossing came up on the third morning, low and brown against the flats, the water tower first and then the rooftops and then the street. We rode in slow. A few people on the boardwalk looked up and went back to what they were doing. Hetty Marsh's boarding house was on the north end, 2 stories, painted white a year or 2 ago. Hetty came out onto the porch when she heard us ride up. She was a stout woman in her 50s with a face that had seen everything and judged very little of it. She looked at Ada. She looked at the bruise that was still visible under Ada's jaw. She looked at me. She said, "You bringing her trouble or taking her away from it?" I said, "Taking her away from it." Hetty said, "All right then, come in." I helped Ada down from the mule and carried her things to the porch, and she stood on the bottom step and looked at me, and I could see her working out how to say something. She said, "You're going to ride on, aren't you?" I said, "Not yet." She looked at me. I said I thought I might see about work in the area. Give it some time, see how things go. She reached out then. It was the first time she'd done that, reached for me, and she put her hand against my chest, flat, the way she'd had her hands flat on the wagon tailgate that first morning. Only this time it wasn't to hold herself up. It was just to place herself, I think, to make something real that might not quite feel real yet. She said quietly, "That's a good plan, Cole Whitfield." I put my hand over hers, just for a moment. Her knuckles were still rough and red from the weeks of work. I could feel the bones of her fingers. I said, "Go on inside, get some rest." She did. She went up those steps and through that door, and I stood there in the street for a minute, my horse's reins in my hand, the sun coming over the rooftops and laying long shadows across the dust. Hetty Marsh had stayed on the porch. She looked at me and said, "There's a man named Garrett who runs cattle 2 miles east. He takes on good hands in the fall." I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "Don't disappoint her." I said, "I'm not planning to." Hetty nodded and went inside. I stood in that street a while longer. The town was going about its business around me. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. A dog crossed the road without hurrying. I'd been moving for 15 years. I'd had reasons before, or told myself I did. The work was somewhere else. The pay was better somewhere else. There was something somewhere else worth getting to. Mostly it had been none of those things. Mostly it had been the simple fact that nobody had needed me to stay. I tied my horse at the post in front of Garrett's feed store and went in to ask about work. That was the fall of 1882. I won't say it was easy. A man and a woman finding a way to be with each other when both of them have been shaped hard by hard things. That takes time, and it takes honesty, and it takes the kind of patience that doesn't feel like patience at the time. It just feels like one day following the next without either of you giving up. But we did that. We did one day following the next. There's a porch on the house we built east of town, faces south, catches the afternoon light. She sits out there sometimes in the evenings when the work is done, a cup of coffee in her hands, and I come out and I sit down beside her and she leans, just slightly, just her shoulder against mine, and that's the whole of it. That's the whole of what I have to tell you. I didn't set out to be the man who rode out of a cattle camp before dawn with a woman and a cold coffee pot and a borrowed mule. I didn't set out to be any particular kind of man. But that morning in the Cimarron country, when I lifted that cold pot off the dead fire and understood what it meant, something in me made a decision that I didn't think about too hard. It turned out to be the best decision of my life. Her shoulder against mine in the evening light, the smell of wood smoke off her hair, the way she laughs now, easy, like she learned it again after a long time of forgetting when something strikes her funny. That's what I kept in the end. That's what I got to keep.